knows exactly why we wanted the four of you talk here tonight about the density and the richness of your presentations was amazing, and I also like how much they address different aspects of the topic, kind of interacted with each other that we did not plan about. So the idea for the discussion is I have a kind of questionnaire, but I would love if it would develop kind of organically. I would also like to involve the audience if they like to. So I can of course start with some thoughts or some questions I'm interested in, but you're very welcome to take over and also bounce questions back to me. Maybe kind of could also try to represent a group of authors which kind of contributed to this discussion before in the magazine. One question I would like to open with is, Remo, you addressed the question of performance, and when we kind of started thinking about queer architecture, I very quickly dropped these topics at the beginning. We were coming across these two strategies of camp and referentiality. So this was kind of dealt with as the core of queer architecture, at least gay architecture, because it was also kind of focused firstly on male architects. So this, you kind of had a negative attitude to it, kind of asking what is the reference for, what is the irritation for if it does not perform, and you kind of push it away, saying the firm, I'm not interested in it because the reference itself has no value, the irritation also not if it's not performing. So I would like to talk about this idea of architecture as something triggering performance, or kind of being a stage for things. And maybe you can kind of take the ball about this.
Actually, I'm not sure if you have misunderstood me or perhaps have been not very precise, but actually, performance is a very important part of doing architecture in a clear sense. They are referring to Harry and Sarah Ahmed as well. I mean, performing is describing creating a corporate sense with things which are among you, but also interacting with entities. Therefore, no, performance is definitely a very important part, but also a strategy of survival within queering practices. Therefore, no to no performance, yes to performance, as a very important way of practicing architecture. No, performance is very important.
Yeah,
the bodily inscription of
most important aspect, actually. If it's about creating architecture, you put the performance on the forefront, and the reference and the irritation kind of maybe as a starting point, because once you use the irritation, you start to question the norms, and then you start to ask yourself, how can you trigger different performances, right? I understood it this way.
Yeah, indeed.
I mean, the only thing that I can speak to is maybe this notion of camp that you mentioned. Just like interestingly, in the work of this art group, and then also the falling out between the artists around Mere de Maras and General Idea as an art group. General Idea, those of you who know their work, they work very heavily with this camp aesthetic. Particularly in their sort of early kind of performance-based work, which was called Miss General Idea. It's basically the idea of a pageant, a sort of beauty queen kind of event, and this Miss General Idea was a sort of fictional character that was sort of performed again and again, and sort of pointed precisely to how these kind of cultural signification systems that in a way sort of create meaning, that create this sort of stability of meaning, that uphold the straight line between the binary gender order and so on, that in a way through these performative acts you can begin to kind of destabilize that. You can begin to destabilize meaning. That's also what people like Judith Butler talk about when they speak about sort of the performance and performativity of gender as a kind of system. as something that is almost like an act on a stage that is preset to some extent, that is predefined. But what I find interesting, so for instance, Maras, this group, they really rejected that. They dealt much more with questions of kind of language and how language operates. But they were also very much interested in performance, as in the performance of space, the performance of architecture, and how the architectural space, both in its kind of material, but also in its kind of larger immaterial social dimension, performs to bring about these sort of networks of people, can bring about sort of collective identities and create collective bodies where there is a process that is in a sort of constant unfolding in a way, a kind of constant becoming. So they were much, much more interested, less in these kind of, undoing of these kind of signification practices, but really in sort of how can we create ecosystems. That's also why I'm interested in this kind of term of ecologies, how can we create the ecosystems in which people, things, practices can coexist and flourish. And I think that's sort of what I find interesting about this work, but perhaps that's also why somebody like Maras has been overlooked by architectural history in a way, because his work is in that sense not very architectural, or I don't know, wouldn't be considered in this kind of mainstream view of what constitutes a sort of worthy architectural practice. It would sort of fall under the radar a little bit.
Yeah, what actually happened with the camp and also the drag, but there's also something you can call drag architecture. With these movements, it's like a different or reappreciation of the decoration. And then you also kind of address this question, the skepticism of modernity towards decoration for several reasons. And now there is this group, at least we're talking, I think, about maybe about the 70s, early 80s, they embraced this decoration. First you can kind of judge it as totally senseless collection of emotional objects, but it then turns into something different. And I think we have also interest in kind of question or addressing these questions of decoration within architecture. Again, I would be interested in your point of view. And do you see these strategies or the way to reintroduce is related, or is it something different?
I think there's much to say about first of all, to come back to the performance, even if I don't answer directly, but I think there's much to say that has not been analyzed about the tools of the architects, because as much as, in art, we would find many kinds of performance acts that would lead to global visions of the world or to utopias. This is something that does not exist in the mainstream architecture. So architects actually have not changed much since almost since the 19th century. Okay, they have changed their boards by computers, but in terms of what they do with their tools, it's pretty much the same, which is this bird-eye view of I would even of what is to be planned, and I would even dare to say that usually architects start designing by the exterior one. So it's once again this idea of the erection. Probably almost no architect starts by the interior, where people actually live. So I think I also I was very intrigued by the latest Richard Sennett book talking about urbanism and saying maybe actually sociology as a travail de terrain could also be interesting, which is also a performative act. Once you go there and you start collecting data yourself, it is also maybe a tool that hasn't been considered in architecture. But to come back to this decoration, actually, it's funny that when I started reading the building sets from Betsky, I was reading the thank yous in the beginning, and he thanks his dean or something, because he actually started teaching in an interior design school. I don't remember now. And of course, I don't want to compare myself to Betsky, but it was actually when I started teaching at the head in the interior design department that I started questioning myself about this idea of decoration that has completely disappeared or been neglected by the this male architecture attitude that still today, I mean, and as much as we would like it to be otherwise, still in most of the critiques that we assist to, decorative is synonymous of superfluous, bad, not necessary. So if you want to criticize a project, you need to say that it's decorative. So it's still there. And I had this utopian idea of actually rewriting, because actually the interesting thing about interior design is that it actually does not have a real history of theory. It's kind of like a patchwork of many things, which is very interesting, but it doesn't have a proper, scholar background and history. Whereas, as I learned in high school, the beginning of modernism with all these guys, William Morris, and William Morris ended up his life doing wallpaper, as kind of like a socialist act. So very linked to a political, I mean, not very linked, completely linked to a political. So I was, and then it's maybe the change operates in the second Bauhaus with, of course, Gropius was already there, but when Hannes Meyer takes over, and he has a very strong political agenda that it would be interesting to analyze as well. I don't know it so well, but as a once again, political, yes, very important because it was politically social, but still yet very military male agenda to actually accomplish architecture. Even the first Bauhaus, it was still interesting when they do the Sommerfeld House, as a manifesto. Come on, that was a manifesto of the Bauhaus, and it was still this log house where probably the house itself, as in the Red House in Morris, was not so important. What was important was how it was decorated and actually worked out together with the number of people working in it. So I think this is something that we have, and of course it's also funny this idea of the primitive hut and the cave, because yes, I mean you could restart the history by by calling the painting as the beginning, and the painting and the fire making as the beginning of architectural history, and then of course the decorative comes into play immediately. I think this discussion will be very different with artists. How do they consider the decorative? Because they have a larger view and multiplicity of history is a little bit more rich than ours.
I think it's super interesting. Like throughout the research for the Biennale project, we also, of course, research a lot of interior, is like the history of interior architecture, and let's say like when this shift sort of started, that sort of material culture sort of disappears from the discipline of architecture completely and goes into lifestyle, magazines. So everything that has to do with interior material culture, which obviously has a lot of meaning. We see like just everything that you mentioned, like modernism, but even before, before the 20th century, like interior was like the materiality of the interior was considered as super meaningful, and everything. Everything, of course, everything was also controlled in a very specific way. But at some point, this just left the discipline, and it became. It's kind of a dematerialization. Like it became about the shape of the object, really. And that's why we also wanted to go deeper into these kind of interiors.
When we visited the pavilion in Venice afterwards in the office, editor's office, we were kind of course, understanding the mechanisms which kind of lead to this normatizations, the economical reasons, the political reasons, and we were wondering, is an alternative? And of course, these external forces are so strong. Still, we wonder, is there something that can be done from within the discipline of architecture to tackle it, to attack it, to change it? Maybe that's for the three of you. You are also practicing architects. Is there a chance to push something in a different direction against these strong normative powers with the tools of the architect?
It's very difficult, of course. I mean, that's a question no one can answer really. But I mean, what is certainly something that I think is helpful, and what I think, like talking to architects, and also looking at a lot of floor plans and then the actual apartment, is that a lot of, I mean, now I'm talking about housing obviously, but could be also described with other technologies, is that many times the plan is the main informer for the design, and many times I have the impression that the plan is just extruded. Like for instance, just looking at the interior as a three-dimensional object that not only has one plane to consider is something that already helps, but of course it doesn't change the system.
Yeah, but the food chain of decision is contaminated by the same disease.
Yes, of course.
Because my answer as a practitioner, it would be no. I mean, you cannot fight against regulations unless you work for people who decide to live otherwise, outside of these regulations, and that's where we're talking again about the norm and the margins. So actually, the only way to not live in a 9 square meter room is actually to be a marginal, and create something else or be illegal. So that's the whole problem, is the whole chain of decisions, and they go up to political issues, and they actually, I don't want to say plant the plants because it would be a too nice word for them, but they freeze the plants with criteria, as you were speaking about how a family has to be, because they are imposing you how to live with those plants. If you have 6 kids, also it's a problem. If you have no kids, or if you are 3, household, whatever, the norm is quite clear. It's 2 and 2. So it's very difficult. I mean, in Switzerland we have a Güter, the cooperative that do a bit of work on that, but it's still very shy.
Then when you've been drawing, you had this drawing with the frame, talking about what's the norm and who's inside and who's outside. And it seems so far, like especially in Western society, the group outside wasn't so big, so many thought it doesn't matter, we can kind of get along with it. But also, as I already addressed in my introduction, now it seems we're facing like threats which kind of question if we can kind of just accept this setting as I mentioned, climate change, and as I mentioned, migration. So now there seem to be forces at work which make it impossible to ignore these kind of inside-outside, this binary relationship. And something we were wondering when you were discussing about in the editor's office, now addressing climate change, addressing migration, can the idea of queering not only architecture, but the idea of queering society maybe help to readjust or kind of be a jumping board to address these questions, which seem now way bigger as the one, do we have full acceptance of LGBTQ people, which is of course, I think, important for me from a personal standpoint, but at these larger questions at stake, can that give us some hint how to deal with it?
I'm not sure if queering these kind of problems might help us solve them, but at least expose them. And I think what I would like to add, and I mentioned in my presentation, is the very fact that when we talk about this in and outside references and this margins especially, right? You're addressing these margins. I think what is very important, you can be a marginalized person or living or being situated in a marginalized position. But actually, it is much about the position. You can be queer, right? You can be queer in a very dominant position, right? So therefore, I think I'm not very sure if you can really solve or address this issue, because there are a lot of people which belong to certain groups, and yet they are in very powerful positions. Therefore, I think it is somehow twisted. My friend in Berkeley, Ramon Grossvogel, insists on this very fact. There are a lot of feminist female, obviously, living in Western countries, which are in a position of security, right? And there are a lot of male people in the third world not having this very position. I think what we need to address, why our queerness is referring to this very positionality. I think position is very important. And making this position, how do you say, transparent. That would be perhaps a strategy.
I have a little
I mean, one of the things that I thought was sort of very clear about your presentation and this notion of the frame, in a way, is that the frame itself is something that is installed in order to create the idea, or the sort of seeming idea of stability, of something being in a kind of natural and balanced state of things, which, in a way, things never really are. You know, they're always in kind of dynamic flux and in a state of sort of constant kind of evolution and change. But what the frame does, it fixes something temporarily. And I think we're in this moment right now, where perhaps we're becoming much more aware and conscious of the kinds of frames and the sort of seeming, naturalness of, let's say, our sort of capitalist mode of production and way of living and so on. And that this, in a way, we're at this point now, I think, where there's a great deal of anxiety around sort of questioning patriarchy, questioning sort of orders that put people into racialized categories and sort of uphold the sort of stability of like a supposedly natural hierarchy, etc., etc. And all of these things are, at this moment, I think, at this point where they expose their artificiality and their fragility, and I think that's a really positive thing, but at the same time, I think we can also see very much the sort of backlash and this kind of desperate holding on to these frames, at every turn. I mean, I think the current coronavirus crisis has also kind of exposed that very strongly, this kind of weighing up of, I don't know, economic. On one level, I think, certain things were thinkable and doable that in 30 years haven't been done. All the planes suddenly stopped and so on, and were grounded for months. And at the same time, it's this kind of weighing up, right? Of, do we risk our sort of wealth and the way it is being produced? And these are they're really tricky questions, but
Although this very frame is flexible and has a certain, quality also, yet it rests up to a certain point, and this is in my mind a very pessimistic view, quite strong. And if you're coming now back to this very queer question, I mean, you see also a tendency within queer community reproducing this heteronormativity, right? Sarah Ahmed in Queer Phenomenology has a very nice section where she emphasized that, saying that, actually, this is very question of who is the man and who is the woman, right? And we are, this very sameness, I mean, it is very heavily ingrained, and shifting this frames is very, very, very tricky. And Ramon Grossvogel, I was putting it up very placative, white, male, patriarchic, etc. He has really gone through it, idea of history. He really tried to understand how these norms have established, and they haven't established overnight, right? So, and shifting these norms is, again, another big, needs a lot of power, agency, performance, again, and perhaps we can go via small stories, right? Not anymore the big trajectories, going through small stories, right?
I mean, my let's say revelation or discovery when approaching the queer theory or other readings, considering Haraway or Anna Tsing was very important for me. Is this idea, that maybe actually the margins are they have to stay marginal, and that's okay, because there's a tendency always with all the margins, and I think part of that you want to raise them up to actually at one point become normal. And this idea of small stories that connect with each other, then maybe it's just another way of building up from below or from the side or from whatever, and then just not be fair. I mean, it's just an idea, because once again, I don't think I can detach myself, and I can't, as a white male born under Franco in 72, it's very difficult. And reading Heidegger and discovering Heidegger when I was, lecture school, is very difficult to not come to this very polarized ideas. But maybe the trick is there. Maybe the trick is not to fall into that trip and kind of start always refer to these linking lines or storylines that also have to be imaginary with what so-called pragmatism that is very rooted in capitalist society. So it's extremely difficult. I cannot do it like that. I do it on my work, thinking that all these small things can really add up to something, whatever that is. But theoretically, I struggle quite a lot to just project myself into small things. And I think that's also kind of like a lesson of interiority as well, domesticity, or of this, how do you take care of just small surroundings, and how do you do that, even in theoretical ways.
And to your point about this sort of robustness of these frames, I think again what's interesting here is I'm just being reminded of the work of Wanda Schubin, who's a medical historian, and the way in which this brings me back to this idea of kind of narrative and how narratives are often operating as kind of supporting devices for this. How she talks about living also at the moment when sort of in a way biological science begins to develop and these taxonomies are being established, it's very much through the lens of sort of cultural norms that exist at the time, and she sort of makes this evident by the way in which he sort of began to look at species in a kind of anthropomorphized way, as sort of having two genders, plant, animals, and everything was like humans in this kind of binary. And so that in a way sort of sets up this narrative that then becomes extremely powerful. And the same is true with, these tableaus that we are familiar with in archaeological, anthropological museums and so on, where we see the sort of family, the Urfamilie, depicted as the sort of family unit, as sort of male, female, children, almost like representing the Holy Family. When of course we know that this is like a complete sort of fiction, and yet we sort of don't seem to be able to recognize today's power of stories there. That's, with counter stories could be tackled.
I want to open up for questions of the audience if they would like to jump in. Martin has a microphone in his hand, and we'll be lucky to pass it around if you would like to ask questions or give comments to the directions of the conversation.
I'm actually quite curious to know a bit what is this queer space, so what does that mean? And I think you all trying to also define it by talking about the opposite, talking about the straight line, or talking about the heteronormia, or like the new housing development in Zurich. So trying to talk about queer space by talking about heteronormative space. And I was wondering if you had an idea of what would be for you a really good example of a queer space, or something that could be defined as such, that you wouldn't have done yourself somehow. Like if you have an idea of what such a space would be.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a good question because I also think there's a certain danger in just using the term a queer space. I think I can relate to queering architecture. Queer architecture, I think, is a little bit not problematic, but I just ask myself if queer. I will come to queer space in a minute. If queer architecture exists, then feminine and masculine architecture also exists, which actually, in my sense of understanding, suggests that male or men are responsible for male architecture, or masculine architecture. Females are responsible for feminine architecture, and queer people are responsible for queer architecture, where actually I think it shouldn't be put into gendered categories. But that's just just one thing, because I also don't really know what queering architecture means, or but queer space, I guess, to me is just, and I'm speaking as a person, like a personal experience as a lesbian person in this world, is, I guess, every sphere where I don't feel uncomfortable.
I also have I don't have a definition, but I have like an idea of what for me queer space is today. It's an architecture as a space which kind of encourages you to experience otherness, everything that is different than yourself, everything that makes you realize that there is a bigger world, a more complex world outside the one we might know from these more binary narrations we are most of the time confronted with. So whatever helps to lead me to this otherness and kind of make me experience something new, which is outside of my existing knowledge or ethics or moral ideas whatsoever, I think is for me a queer space, though it's not connected to sexuality anymore, but to the other. That would be my definition. It's of something which has a quality which I would like to call queer space.
And just perhaps to add, this very question, actually at the end of the day, is a very, I'm putting out a very, in a very prominent way, is a Western question. Yeah? It's very Western, because it's very phenomenon of being queer, now from a sexual point of view, but also beyond that, is something which has been introduced via Christianity. This is a very interesting concept, but this will be out of scope for today's discussion. But actually, queerness was everyday practice in a lot of African and Asian culture. And they have been exposed to very different setups simultaneously. And it was not banned as something, it has not been narrowed or streamlined. So there were a lot of different options, thinking of potentiality. And I just can add to what you just have said, that this could be this very queer space. And again, perhaps also it is, this very question or this very phenomenon we're discussing here has also to be read within the history of ideas, right? And this very question has been introduced and established through our Western framework. So just try.
I mean, I always like, we talked about Sarah but in this text that you also mentioned orientations towards the queer phenomenology, I think she speaks about a sort of slanted line, and I think you also mentioned this idea of a space that doesn't allow people to sort of disappear into the background or to assume a neutral position. So something that in a way kind of activates you, that to some extent also causes a sense of discomfort, but perhaps for people who aren't already sort of on the straight line, can also provide a sense of comfort or sort of make you realize that your body in its sort of otherness sort of fits into that space better than into that space that in a way sort of demands this kind of neutrality.
I also didn't mean like discomfort as a feeling that is not good in that sense, but of course, that clarifies everything.
I would have said just improvising. I would say like the wrong answer, but
absolutely clear.
But I would have said that probably spaces where we are confronted to other living beings with a strong presence. So let's say what we usually call nature in many forms. When you get bit by an insect or things like that, and you're exposed in a relationship with other living beings that we don't control at all. I mean, it's a very reductive, of course, definition of nature, if nature still exists. But I would have thought that those are. I mean, of course, there are the traditional historical clubs and all those spaces. But in my opinion, if you consider all living beings as being part of contribution to space, then there are many things that we don't control and we are exposed to in those natural spaces.
I'm very happy that you led the discussion there and would like to close it there. This interest in the question, how do we interact or how do we design or build environment in relation to the other species is actually something we want to have a deeper look next year. So the June issue next year, it has a working title called Coexistence, and we're also very much interested in this discourse Donna Haraway has established. So I see that you're interested in it, and I'm really happy to realize it because we're also kind of chewing and thinking about these kind of things, and this is maybe kind of leads to a preview what we will be working on, and maybe one or several of you will join in this discussion at some point later. I want to thank you very much and ask the audience for another applause for your great lectures and this great discussion. Thank you.